in the gentle fold of the English countryside, where the meadows of St. Mary Mead gave way to older, shadowed woods, stood Rosemere Hall. It was not one of those grand, arrogant houses that demanded admiration. Rather, it was a tired, once handsome manor of grey stone and creeping ivy, its mullioned windows looking out like weary eyes that had seen too many secrets and too few joys. For more than 2 centuries the Ashworth family had lived there, but in recent years the house had begun to reflect the spirit of its master. Reclusive, fading, and quietly defiant against the march of time, Sir Reginald Ashworth, the last baronet of his line, had withdrawn from the world after the war. Some in the village said it was grief over his wife's early death. Others whispered of darker matters, break time 05s, of letters that arrived from distant places, and of nights when the lights in his study burned until dawn. Whatever the truth, he had become a ghost in his own home, tended only by a handful of servants, and visited rarely by his remaining family. It was on a damp October evening in 1952 that the quiet of Rosemere Hall was broken by a single, terrible cry. Miss Jane Marple was not at Rosemere that night. She was comfortably settled in her own sitting room at St. Mary Mead, her knitting needles clicking steadily as she worked on a soft lamb's-wool shawl for the vicar's new grandchild. A fire crackled in the hearth, and her old friend Dolly Bantry had just left after an evening of gossip and bridge. The world felt pleasantly small and orderly, precisely the way Miss Marple liked it. The telephone rang at 10:15. Break time 05s. Jane? The voice on the line belonged to Dr. Haydock, sounding unusually strained. I'm afraid there's been a death at Rosemere Hall, Sir Reginald. Heart attack, by all appearances. But, well, I'd be easier in my mind if you could come in the morning. There are 1 or 2 small matters that don't quite sit right. Miss Marple's needles paused for only a moment. I shall come directly after breakfast, my dear doctor, she replied calmly. Please see that nothing is disturbed more than necessary. The next morning dawned grey and misty. Miss Marple, dressed in her best tweed coat and sensible shoes, accepted a lift from the vicar's wife, as far as the lodge gates of Rosemere. From there she walked up the long drive, her sharp blue eyes taking in every detail, the overgrown rose beds that had once been Lady Ashworth's pride, break time 05s, the fresh tyre tracks in the gravel, and the faint imprint of a woman's evening shoe near the side path that led to the terrace. A young constable stood uncomfortably at the front door. He recognised her at once. Miss Marple's reputation had a way of travelling quietly through the county. Dr. Haydock is inside, ma'am, in the study. The study was a handsome room on the ground floor, its walls lined with books and faded hunting prints, heavy velvet curtains still drawn against the morning light. Sir Reginald Ashworth sat slumped in his leather armchair behind the great oak desk, his head fallen forward, one hand still resting on an open ledger. He had been a tall man in life. Death had made him look strangely shrunken. Dr. Haydock rose as she entered. Jane, break time, 5s. Thank you for coming so quickly. Miss Marple removed her gloves and looked about her with gentle interest. The door had been locked from the inside, the key still in the lock. One window was fastened shut. The other stood open a few inches, but the drop outside was sheer and the flower bed below undisturbed. A half-empty glass of whisky stood on the desk beside a fountain pen, silver with elegant engraving. The room smelled faintly of old books, peat smoke from the dying fire, and something else, something delicate and out of place. Perfume, murmured Miss Marple. Rather expensive, I should say. Not the sort one expects in a gentleman's study. Haydock nodded grimly. Exactly. And there's more. The fountain pen is missing its cap. I found it over there, behind the curtain. Break time 05s. As if it had been dropped in haste. Miss Marple moved closer to the body, though she was careful not to touch anything. Sir Reginald's face was peaceful, almost too peaceful, yet there was a faint bluish tinge to his lips that the doctor had already noted. Heart attack, you said? She asked softly. On the surface, yes. He had a weak heart. Everyone knew that. But I attended him only last month. His condition was stable. And then there's this. Haydock lowered his voice. The family arrived yesterday afternoon for the weekend. They were all here when it happened. Miss Marple's eyes brightened with that particular interest her friends knew so well. The look of a gardener who has just spotted greenfly on her precious roses. Perhaps you had better tell me who was in the house. Break time 05's. Doctor. The family had gathered in the drawing room when she entered, a scene of awkward mourning and thinly veiled tension. There was Gerald Ashworth, the nephew and heir, a handsome man of 40, with thinning fair hair, and the slightly hunted look of one who had never quite lived up to expectations. His wife, Vivienne, was a strikingly elegant woman in her mid-30s, dressed in expensive black that somehow failed to look funereal. She sat twisting a handkerchief, her eyes red but dry. Next to them was Sir Reginald's younger sister, Maud Ellison, a widow with iron-grey hair, pulled back severely, and a mouth that seemed permanently pursed in disapproval. And in the corner, almost forgotten, sat young Celia. Gerald and Vivienne's 17-year-old daughter, pale and silent, break time = 05's. Clutching a small embroidered handkerchief as though it were a lifeline. They all looked up as Miss Marple entered on Dr. Haydock's arm. Miss Marple, Gerald said, rising, we had not expected. That is, how kind of you to come. I knew your uncle many years ago, she said gently. We were never close, but one does not forget old neighbours. Such a sad business. Vivienne gave a little sob that sounded almost rehearsed. He was alone all evening. We thought he had gone to bed early. Then at 9:30 we heard him cry out. When we broke the door open he was already gone. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. Her eyes, however, had noted the faint smear of garden soil on the side of one of Vivienne's elegant evening slippers, carefully placed beneath her chair, a small discordance. Break time 05's. As the conversation turned to arrangements, and the inevitable reading of the will, Miss Marple sat quietly in a high-backed chair, her hands folded in her lap. She listened to the voices, the half-spoken resentments, the careful politeness that covered older wounds. And somewhere, at the back of her mind, a tiny thread began to form. A thread that connected a locked room, a missing pen cap, a trace of perfume, and a child's forgotten nursery rhyme that an old woman had once heard in this very house many years before. The death of Sir Reginald Ashworth had been ruled natural. Miss Marple was already quite certain that it was not. The drawing-room of Rosemere Hall felt oppressively quiet, as though the house itself were holding its breath. Heavy damask curtains muted the grey morning light. Break, time 5's, and the air carried the faint musty scent of old furniture and long unopened rooms. Miss Marple sat in a straight-back chair near the fireplace, her posture perfectly upright, hands resting lightly on the handle of her handbag. To the family, she appeared nothing more than a kindly elderly spinster offering condolences. Only Dr. Haydock, watching from across the room, knew better. Gerald Ashworth cleared his throat. The solicitor, Mr. Pettigrew, will arrive this afternoon for the reading of the will. Uncle Reginald was most particular about it. He wanted us all present, even though he barely spoke to any of us these past 5 years. Maud Ellison said sharply. Sir Reginald's sister had taken a seat by the window, her back rigid. Break, time 05's. One might have thought a dying man would show more Christian feeling toward his only sister. Vivienne Ashworth looked up from her handkerchief. Really, Aunt Maud? Must we do this now? Reginald is hardly cold. Miss Marple noticed the quick glance Vivienne exchanged with her husband, half warning, half plea. Young Celia, meanwhile, had drawn her knees up onto the sofa and was staring into the unlit hearth, her face pale and closed. The girl had her mother's dark hair and fine bones, but there was a fragility about her that spoke of sleepless nights. Perhaps, Miss Marple said in her mildest voice. It would help if we spoke a little of dear Sir Reginald. One feels so helpless at times like these. Remembering often brings comfort. Gerald seized on the suggestion with obvious relief. He was a difficult man, especially after the war. Break time equals 05s. Lost many friends in France, you know. Never quite the same afterwards. He threw himself into estate matters and, well, into silence. He changed, Maud said flatly, became suspicious of everyone. Accused the servants of spying. Even accused me of trying to poison his mind against his own nephew. She gave a short, bitter laugh, as if Gerald needed any help in disappointing him. Gerald flushed. That's unfair, Aunt. I did my best. The rubber plantation in Malaya failed through no fault of mine. Bad luck, that's all. Miss Marple's knitting needles had appeared in her hands as if by magic. The soft click-click filled the brief silence, a deceptively soothing sound. Wars leave many scars, she murmured, not all of them visible. I remember during the last war how some men carried their experiences like hidden weights. Tell me, break time .05s. Was Sir Reginald ever troubled by any particular memory? A log shifted in the fireplace, sending up a small shower of sparks. For a moment no one spoke. It was Celia who answered, her voice barely above a whisper. He used to sing sometimes. Late at night, when he thought no one could hear. A silly nursery rhyme about crows and a secret. It always sounded so sad the way he sang it. One for sorrow, two for joy. Miss Marple quoted gently. Celia nodded, surprised. You know it, an old rhyme, my dear. Children used to sing it in the village long ago. Vivienne stood abruptly and walked to the window. This is all very morbid. I need some air. As she moved, Miss Marple caught another glimpse of the slipper. The soil had been hastily brushed off, but a faint stain remained on the delicate satin. Garden soil, dark and rich. Break time equals 05s. The same earth that bordered the terrace beneath the study window. Dr. Haydock suggested they view the study again before the police remove the body. The family reluctantly agreed. The room looked much as it had earlier, yet in the stronger light certain details stood out more clearly. The faint perfume on the curtain was more noticeable now. A heavy oriental scent, jasmine, and something sharper underneath. Miss Marple paused by the window, her fingers lightly touching the velvet. Such a pretty scent, she remarked. French, I believe, rather modern. Vivienne's hand tightened on the back of a chair. I don't know what you mean. I don't wear heavy perfume. No, of course not, my dear, Miss Marple said kindly. One notices these things so much more when one grows older. The senses compensate. Break time 05s, they say. Gerald moved restlessly behind the desk. Look here, Miss Marple, we all appreciate your concern, but the doctor has already said it was a heart attack. Uncle had been warned repeatedly. He refused to slow down. Quite so, Miss Marple agreed, and yet one wonders why a man who felt unwell would lock his door and open the window on such a chilly night. The fire was almost out, you see. Most people in poor health would have kept the room warmer. Haydock nodded slightly, approving her observation. Miss Marple's eyes travelled to the silver fountain pen lying on the blotter. The cap was still missing. She bent closer, pretending to adjust her spectacles. Such a handsome pen, she said. A presentation piece, I imagine. To Reginald, with gratitude, 1944. The engraving is quite clear. Gerald frowned. Break time 05s. I never noticed that before. No, Miss Marple said softly. One often fails to notice what is right under one's nose. As they left the study, Miss Marple lingered a moment in the corridor. Young Celia had remained behind. The girl stood by the desk, staring at her great-uncle's empty chair with an expression of such sorrow and guilt that Miss Marple's heart tightened. My dear child, she said gently, touching Celia's arm. If there is anything you wish to tell someone, I am very good at listening and at keeping confidences. Celia's eyes filled with tears. He was so angry last night, with all of us. He said terrible things about the past, about someone who betrayed him during the war. Then he told us to get out. That was the last time I saw him alive." She fled the room before Miss Marple could offer more comfort. Break time 5s. Alone for a moment, Miss Marple stood by the open window, looking down at the undisturbed flower-bed below. No footprints, yet the soil on Vivienne's slipper told its own quiet story. And somewhere in the house, she was certain, the missing cap of the fountain pen waited to be found. The threads were still loose and tangled, but they were there, faint, delicate and dangerous, a death that looked natural. A family bound by money, resentment and old secrets, and a nursery rhyme that an old man had sung in the dark hours before his heart stopped forever. Miss Marple closed her eyes for a second, listening to the house. Rosemere Hall felt watchful. She whispered to herself, "Now, my dear, we must be very careful indeed." The afternoon light had turned thin and watery by the time Mr. Pettigrew's elderly Bentley crunched up the drive. Break time 05s. The solicitor was a small, precise man with wire-rimmed spectacles and the air of one who had buried more family secrets than most clergymen. He carried a worn leather portfolio under his arm and offered quiet condolences that somehow managed to sound both sincere and professionally distant. The family assembled once more in the drawing room. A fire had been lit, but it did little to warm the chill that had settled over the gathering. Miss Marple had been invited to remain, as an old friend of the family, Gerald had said, though his tone suggested he was not entirely comfortable with her continued presence. She sat slightly apart, knitting a row of pale blue stitches, her expression one of gentle abstraction. Mr. Pettigrew cleared his throat and began without preamble. "Sir Reginald made his final will 2 months ago, break time or 5s. He was of sound mind, as I can personally attest. There are several small bequests to servants and to the village church. The bulk of the estate, however, including Rosemere Hall and the majority of his investments, goes to his nephew, Gerald Ashworth." Gerald let out a slow breath, as though he had been holding it for years. Vivienne's hand found his and squeezed. A little too tightly, Miss Marple thought. "But there are conditions," the solicitor continued. His voice remained level, yet every ear in the room sharpened. "The inheritance is contingent upon Gerald and Vivienne residing at Rosemere Hall for at least 6 months of each year for the next 5 years. Furthermore, a sum of £15,000 is to be placed in trust for Miss Celia Ashworth, to be released on her 21st birthday, or upon her marriage. Break time meagre 5s, whichever comes first, provided she has not married against her parents' wishes." Celia's head jerked up. "What?" Maud Ellison gave a short, humourless laugh. "How very like Reginald. Even from the grave he tries to control us all." Mr. Pettigrew continued reading in his dry, careful voice. There were smaller legacies, a silver tea service to Maud, some books and a modest income, to various charities Sir Reginald had supported in secret. But it was the final paragraph that caused the deepest silence. "To the person who knows why I have lived these last years as a prisoner in my own home," Pettigrew read, "I leave nothing but my forgiveness, if they can find the courage to ask for it before God." A heavy stillness fell. Vivienne's face had gone very pale beneath her powder. Gerald stared at the carpet as though it might offer answers. Break time 05s. Only Celia seemed genuinely bewildered. Miss Marple's needles clicked on steadily. After the solicitor had departed, promising to return in a few days with the necessary papers, the family drifted apart like people escaping an uncomfortable theatre. Miss Marple found herself walking slowly through the long gallery with Maud Ellison. The older woman's steps were sharp and angry. "He was a hard man, my brother," Maud said at last, "even before the war. But something happened in 1943 that finished him. He came back from London changed, suspicious, cruel almost." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. "One hears rumours, of course. Something about intelligence work during the war." Maud stopped by a portrait of a long-dead Ashworth in military uniform. He never spoke of it directly. But there was a mission in occupied France. Several men died. Break time 05s. Reginald survived. Afterwards he used to say that betrayal wears a familiar face. She gave a dry laugh. He looked at all of us that way in the end. They walked on. Miss Marple's mind was busy with small facts. The date on the fountain pen, 1944, and the nursery rhyme Celia had mentioned. Pieces, still scattered. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple made her way to the kitchens. The cook, Mrs. Briggs, was an old acquaintance from village affairs. Over a cup of strong tea and a slice of seed cake, the woman spoke freely. Sir Reginald had grown that frightened these last months, Mrs. Briggs confided, lowering her voice. He kept his study locked even during the day, said someone was moving his papers, and he stopped eating anything prepared downstairs, insisted on opening his own tins. Poor gentleman, paranoid, some called it. Break time 05s. But I wonder now. Miss Marple gently steered the conversation toward the previous evening. Mrs. Briggs remembered Vivienne going out to the garden after dinner, saying she needed air. She had returned after 20 minutes, rather flushed. "And young Miss Celia?" Miss Marple asked. "Poor lamb went to her room early, looked as though she'd been crying. There's trouble there, mark my words. That mother of hers pushes her toward a certain young man in London. Flashy sort. Sir Reginald was dead against it." As evening drew in, Miss Marple found young Celia sitting alone in the small morning room, staring at a photograph of her great-uncle as a young man in uniform. The girl's eyes were swollen. "He wasn't always like this," Celia said suddenly. "When I was small, he used to tell me stories about crows and secrets. Break time 05s. He said the rhyme wasn't really about birds at all. It was about counting enemies, one for sorrow, because there was always one traitor." Miss Marple sat beside her. "And did he ever name this traitor, my dear?" Celia hesitated. "He said some betrayals happen because people are weak, not because they're wicked. Last night, he told father he knew everything. About the money, about the letters. Then he made us all leave." Her voice broke. "I wish I had stayed. I wish I had told him I was sorry." "Sorry for what, child?" But Celia only shook her head and fled upstairs. Miss Marple remained seated for a long time. The house had grown quiet, yet she could feel its pulse. Old resentments, fresh fears, and something darker moving beneath the surface. She thought of the soil on Vivien's slipper, break time 05s. The exotic perfume on study curtains that no one would claim, the missing pen cap, and an old man singing a nursery rhyme to himself in the dark. Dr. Haydock found her there later. "Any conclusions, Jane?" "Not yet," she replied softly. "But I am beginning to see the shape of it. This was not a sudden death, Doctor. It was the final chapter of something that began many years ago." She looked toward the stairs where Celia had disappeared. "And I fear there may be more than one hidden death in Rosemere Hall before this is finished." Outside, the October wind stirred the ivy against the windows, sounding almost like dry, mocking laughter. The following morning brought a thin veil of rain that blurred the boundaries between Rosemere Hall's gardens and the surrounding woods. Break 05s. Miss Marple stood at the drawing-room window, watching the drops slide down the glass like slow, silent tears. She had slept little, her mind turning over the fragments she had gathered so far. Small things, always the small things, she reminded herself. A grain of sand could derail an entire train of deception if one knew where to look. Breakfast had been a strained affair. Gerald ate little, his eyes heavy with sleeplessness. Vivienne appeared composed in a charcoal day dress, but her smiles were brittle. Maud Ellison dominated the conversation with sharp remarks about the expense of funerals and the ingratitude of the younger generation. Only Celia was absent, claiming a headache. After the meal, Miss Marple excused herself for a gentle walk around the grounds. Doctor, break time 05s. Haydock had arranged for the police to delay their formal removal of the body until later that day, giving her precious hours. She carried a small basket, as though she were merely collecting autumn leaves or late roses for pressing. Her first stop was the terrace beneath the study window. The flower bed was indeed undisturbed. No footprints, no crushed plants. Yet when she knelt carefully and examined the soil with her gloved fingers, she found what she was seeking, a faint depression where something narrow had been pressed down and then lifted. The mark of a ladder, or perhaps a long-handled tool used from above. She straightened, brushing earth from her hands. A few yards away, near the yew hedge, she discovered something far more telling, the missing cap of Sir Reginald's silver fountain pen. It lay half hidden among fallen leaves, Bay Break Time 05s. Its engraved surface dull with moisture. Miss Marple picked it up with her handkerchief and slipped it into her basket. She did not smile, but her eyes gleamed with quiet satisfaction. Returning to the house, she encountered young Celia descending the stairs. The girl looked drawn, her youth suddenly fragile. "Miss Marple," Celia said hesitantly, "may I speak with you, privately?" They settled in the little morning room where the light was kinder. Celia twisted her hands in her lap. "I loved Great-Uncle Reginald," she began, her voice trembling, "even when he was difficult. Last year he took me to see the old nursery on the top floor. It hadn't been used since my father was small. He showed me a loose floorboard where he used to hide things as a boy. He said some secrets were safer in the past." Miss Marple leaned forward. "Break time 05s. And did he hide something there recently, my dear?" Celia's eyes filled with tears. "I don't know. He made me promise not to tell anyone I'd been up there with him. Mother would be furious. She says I spend too much time thinking about the past instead of my future. She wants me to marry, well, you see. There's a man in London, Mr. Desmond Hartley. He's very charming, but Great-Uncle hated him. Called him a fortune hunter." The pain in the girl's voice touched Miss Marple deeply. She placed a gentle hand over Celia's. "Children, and young women, often carry burdens they should not have to bear alone. If there is anything more," Celia shook her head, "that's all, but I feel so guilty." The last words I heard him say were angry ones, about betrayal, about how the people closest to you are the ones who can hurt you most. After Celia left, break, time, or 5s. Miss Marple made her way quietly up the narrow back stairs to the old nursery. The room was dusty and forlorn, with faded wallpaper depicting nursery rhymes. Crows perched on a fence in one corner of the design. Miss Marple's lips tightened. She found the loose floorboard exactly where Celia had described. Beneath it lay a small tin box. Inside were several yellowed letters tied with ribbon, a faded photograph of a group of men in wartime uniform, and a single sheet of recent notepaper. On it, in Sir Reginald's spidery hand, were written the words, "One for sorrow, the crow has come home." Miss Marple read 2 of the letters. They were from 1944, written by a man named Captain Leonard Voss, who had served with Reginald in France. The tone was increasingly desperate. "Break time 05s, speaking of the mistake we made, and the information that should never have reached the Germans." The final letter ended with, "If this comes to light, it will destroy us all." She replaced the items carefully, her heart heavy. The emotional weight of old betrayals pressed upon the house like the rain outside. Downstairs, voices were rising in the library. Miss Marple approached silently and paused outside the half-open door. "You never told me the full extent of it." Gerald's voice was low and furious. "The debts, the forged signatures. How could you be so stupid? Vivian." "I did it for us," came his wife's reply, sharp with fear and defiance. "Your uncle was going to cut you off entirely. Desmond Hartley offered help, a loan, nothing more. I only signed the papers to protect our future. Break time 05s and Celia's." Miss Marple heard the sound of a fist striking wood. "And now he's dead, and the will ties us to this crumbling mausoleum for 5 years. If the truth about the money comes out—" "It won't," Vivienne snapped. "Not unless someone talks." Miss Marple retreated softly before she was noticed. The perfume on the study curtains, expensive French, the sort a woman trying to impress a sophisticated man, like Desmond Hartley, might wear. And the soil on the slipper, perhaps from hurrying back across the garden after an urgent, whispered conversation beneath the study window. Lunch was announced with forced civility. Miss Marple ate little, observing the undercurrents. Maud watched everyone with narrowed eyes, as though calculating her own diminished share. Gerald drank too much wine. Vivienne's laughter was brittle. Celia barely spoke. Break time, 0.5s. In the afternoon, Miss Marple took Dr. Haydock aside in the garden. "I believe Sir Reginald died of poison," she said quietly. "Not the dramatic kind, but something slow-acting that would mimic a heart attack in a man with a weak heart. Digitalis, perhaps, or something similar, administered over time. The final dose may have been given yesterday evening." Haydock's face tightened. "You have proof?" "Only threads," she replied. "But they are beginning to form a pattern woven from wartime guilt, financial desperation, and a very clever, patient hand." She did not mention the nursery rhyme yet, nor the tin box. Those pieces still needed careful placement. As the rain intensified, Miss Marple returned to her room to rest. Yet her mind would not be still. She thought of an old man singing sadly to himself, "Break time, 0.05s." Of a young girl caught between past and future, and of a locked room that had not been quite as impenetrable as it seemed, somewhere in Rosemere Hall, the person who had slowly eroded Sir Reginald's peace of mind, and finally stopped his heart, was moving among them, smiling, mourning, and waiting. Miss Marple picked up her knitting once more. The clicking needles sounded steady and reassuring, but her blue eyes were grave. The hidden death was no longer quite so hidden. The rain continued into the afternoon, drumming steadily against the tall windows of Rosemere Hall, as though the house itself were weeping for its late master. Miss Marple had retired to the small upstairs sitting room that had once belonged to Lady Ashworth. From here she could see both the front drive and the side terrace. She sat with her knitting, break time 05s, but her hands moved slowly, almost absently, while her mind worked with quiet precision. A police inspector had finally arrived from Milchester. A solid, red-faced man named Craddock, no relation to her friend at Scotland Yard, but courteous enough. He had examined the study, asked routine questions, and seemed inclined to accept Dr. Haydock's initial verdict of natural causes. Miss Marple had not yet challenged him openly. She knew from long experience that men in authority preferred to reach their own conclusions, preferably without the assistance of elderly spinsters. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Young Celia entered, carrying a tray with tea and biscuits. Her hands trembled slightly as she set it down. "I thought you might like something warm, Miss Marple. The house feels so cold today. How kind you are. Break time or 5s." "My dear." Miss Marple studied the girl's face. There were new shadows under her eyes. "Come and sit with me for a moment. Tea always tastes better when shared." Celia perched on the edge of a chair, looking as though she might flee at any moment. After a long silence she spoke. "Mother and Father had another row this morning. I heard them through the wall. It was about money again, and someone called Hartley. Father said terrible things. He accused her of being unfaithful. Not just with money." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Is that why great-uncle died? Because of us?" Miss Marple poured tea with steady hands and passed a cup to the girl. "We must not jump to conclusions, Celia, but secrets have a way of poisoning the air around them. Tell me, break time 05s. Did your great-uncle ever speak to you about Captain Leonard Voss?" Celia looked startled. "The name sounds familiar. I think he mentioned it once when he was angry. He said Voss was the only man who ever truly understood what happened in France. and even he had been weak. She frowned, remembering. He called him the second crow. I didn't understand what he meant. Miss Marple felt a small click of understanding in her mind. One for sorrow, the first crow, and Voss, the second. She changed the subject gently, asking about Celia's life in London and her hopes for the future. The girl spoke wistfully of wanting to study music rather than make a suitable marriage. There was real passion in her voice when she described her piano lessons, and Miss Marple's heart warmed toward her. Break 05s. Here was an innocent soul caught in the crossfire of older sins. Later that afternoon, Inspector Craddock asked to speak with the family collectively. They gathered again in the drawing room. The inspector's questions were methodical, but not particularly inspired. He seemed most interested in the exact timing of events on the night of the death. Vivienne's account was smooth. I went for a short walk in the garden after dinner to clear my head. The rain hadn't started yet. When I returned, I went straight to my room. I fell asleep until we heard the cry. "And you, Mr. Ashworth?" Gerald shifted uncomfortably. I was in the billiard room, alone. I had a glass of brandy and tried to read, but I was too restless. I must have dozed off in the chair. Maud Ellison's lips thinned. I retired early with a headache. Break time .05s. These family gatherings are always exhausting. Celia said nothing about her own movements. Miss Marple spoke only when directly addressed. I was not present that evening, Inspector, but I have been noticing one or two small details. The perfume on the study curtains, for instance. Most unusual. Vivienne's head snapped up. I have already said I was not in the study after dinner. Quite so, my dear, Miss Marple murmured. And yet the scent is very distinctive. Jasmine and vetiver, I believe. Rather like the perfume I noticed on your handkerchief yesterday. A flush crept up Vivienne's neck. Gerald glanced sharply at his wife. Inspector Craddock looked mildly interested, but not convinced. "We'll look into it, madam." But without signs of forced entry or obvious violence. Break time 5s. It's difficult to justify treating this as suspicious. After the inspector left to make telephone calls, the tension in the room crackled like electricity before a storm. Maud turned on Vivienne without warning. "You've always been a liability, my dear. Expensive tastes, expensive friends. If Reginald discovered your little financial arrangements with that Hartley creature, it's no wonder his heart gave out. The shame alone would have been enough. How dare you?" Vivienne rose to her feet, eyes blazing. "You're just jealous because Reginald cut your allowance years ago. We all know you've been living on credit for years, pretending to be the respectable widow." Gerald stepped between them. "That's enough, both of you. Uncle is dead. We should be thinking of the funeral. Break time 05s, not flinging accusations." Miss Marple watched the scene with sorrowful eyes. The mask of family unity was crumbling fast. Old resentments, long suppressed, were rising to the surface like bodies in a flooded river. That evening, after a silent dinner, Miss Marple slipped away to the study once more. The body had been removed, but the room still carried the atmosphere of recent death. She moved slowly around the desk, reconstructing events in her mind. A man sits here, writing perhaps. He hears a sound at the window. He opens it. A conversation takes place, urgent, angry. A small vial or powder is passed, or perhaps something stronger is already working in his bloodstream. He cries out later as the pain strikes, locks the door in panic or habit, and dies alone. Break time 5. She found another small clue near the fireplace, a tiny fragment of dried leaf, not from the garden outside, but from a plant known to contain digitalis-like compounds, foxglove, common enough in English gardens, yet deadly in the wrong hands when concentrated. As she was leaving the study, she nearly collided with Maud Ellison in the corridor. "Still poking about, Miss Marple?" Maud's voice was cold. "I wonder what pleasure you take in other people's tragedies." "No pleasure, I assure you," Miss Marple replied gently. "Only a desire for truth Your brother suffered a great deal before he died, Mrs. Ellison. Not just physically. Maud's face twitched. For a moment something like guilt, or was it fear, flickered in her eyes. Reginald made his own enemies. Wartime decisions have consequences. Break time 05s. He should have left the past buried. She swept away, leaving Miss Marple thoughtful. Later, alone in her room, Miss Marple stood at the window, watching the rain. The nursery rhyme kept echoing in her mind. 1 for sorrow, 2 for joy, 3 for a girl, 4 for a boy. But in Sir Reginald's version, the crows had represented something far more sinister, counting betrayals, counting enemies within the nest. She now believed there had been at least 3 people involved in the slow destruction of Sir Reginald Ashworth. One who supplied information during the war. One who had continued the torment through financial pressure. And one who had delivered the final fatal dose. The question was which hand had truly stopped his heart, and whether that hand would strike again if threatened. Night fell heavily over Rosemere Hall, break, wrapping the old house in a shroud of rain and wind. The storm had worsened, and the ancient elms in the park groaned like old men lamenting forgotten sins. Miss Marple lay awake in the guest bedroom, listening to the house settle around her. Floorboards creaked in empty corridors. A door closed softly somewhere above. The place felt alive with unease, as though Sir Reginald's spirit still lingered, waiting for justice. She rose early the next morning, before the household stirred. Dressed in a warm woolen cardigan and sensible walking shoes, she made her way once more to the old nursery on the top floor. Dust motes danced in the thin grey light filtering through the latticed windows. The crows on the wallpaper seemed to watch her with beady, knowing eyes. Miss Marple lifted the loose floorboard again. The tin box was still there, break, time, or 5s. But someone had disturbed it since her last visit. The letters were slightly out of order, and the photograph of the wartime group had been turned face down. She examined the picture carefully. There were 5 men, including a younger, healthier Sir Reginald. One face had been lightly scratched with a pin or nail. Captain Leonard Voss, she presumed. She slipped the photograph into her pocket and replaced the box. As she descended the narrow stairs, she met Maud Ellison coming up, carrying a small bundle of papers. "Looking for something, Miss Marple." Maud's voice was sharp as broken glass. "Only the comfort of old memories," Miss Marple replied mildly. "Children's rooms have such a soothing quality, don't you think? Even when the children have long grown." Maud's eyes narrowed. "My brother was a sentimental fool in some ways. Break timey 05s. Kept too many relics. I came up to clear some of them away before the funeral. No point in dwelling on the past." "Yet the past has a way of dwelling on us," Miss Marple said gently. "Especially when it contains betrayals that were never properly laid to rest." Maud clutched the papers tighter. "If you are suggesting—" "I suggest nothing, Mrs. Ellison. I only observe. Your brother mentioned a traitor more than once." "A familiar face," he said. The older woman's cheeks flushed with anger or fear. "Reginald destroyed his own happiness with his suspicions. He drove everyone away, even me, his only sister. After my husband died, I had no one. Reginald helped me financially at first, then suddenly stopped. Said I reminded him too much of certain events in France." Miss Marple's voice remained kind. "Break time 05s. And did you know Captain Voss?" Maud hesitated a fraction too long. "I met him once before the war. Charming man. Weak like so many were. He and Reginald were close until, well, that is ancient history. They parted awkwardly." Miss Marple felt certain Maud had been searching for the tin box. The question was whether she had come to destroy evidence or to protect it. Breakfast was another tense affair. Gerald looked haggard, dark circles under his eyes. Vivienne barely touched her food, her usual elegance fraying at the edges. Celia appeared with red-rimmed eyes, and announced she would not attend the funeral. "I can't bear it," she said quietly. "He died thinking we were all against him. Gerald snapped. That's nonsense. We loved him in our own way. Did we? Celia's voice rose with unexpected strength. Break time 05s. You only cared about the money, Father. Mother only cared about keeping up appearances. And Aunt Maud. She stopped, biting her lip. Maud smiled thinly. Go on, child. Do tell us what I cared about. The meal ended in uncomfortable silence. After breakfast, Inspector Craddock returned with a more serious expression. Laboratory results had come back faster than expected. Traces of digitalis had been found in Sir Reginald's whisky glass. Not enough to kill an ordinary man quickly, but lethal for someone with a weakened heart. So it was murder, Craddock said heavily, looking around the drawing room where the family had gathered. I must ask you all not to leave the area. The announcement landed like a stone in still water. Vivian gave a convincing gasp and clutched her husband's arm. Gerald went very pale. Maud sat bolt upright. Break time or 5? Her mouth a thin line. Only Celia seemed almost relieved, as though the truth, however ugly, was better than uncertainty. Miss Marple spoke quietly, after the inspector had taken individual statements. The poison could have been administered over several days, Inspector. Sir Reginald had grown cautious about his food, but he still drank whisky in the evenings. Someone who knew his habits could have introduced it gradually. Craddock nodded. We're checking all the medicine bottles in the house. Digitalis is common enough in heart tonics. Later, Miss Marple walked in the damp garden with Dr. Haydock. The rain had eased to a drizzle. I fear the murderer is someone who loved him once, she said sadly. That is the cruelest kind of crime, Doctor. Not driven by sudden passion, but by years of resentment, weakness, and calculation. Break time 05s, the slow erosion of a man's peace of mind until his heart simply gave way. Haydock sighed. You have someone in mind. Several someones, she admitted, but the hand that delivered the final dose. That is still unclear. The nursery rhyme holds the key. One for sorrow. Sir Reginald saw himself as the first victim of a chain. The question is, who became the second crow? That afternoon, a new visitor arrived, Mr. Desmond Hartley. Tall, sleek, and impeccably dressed in a dark suit, he expressed condolences with professional smoothness. Vivienne greeted him with a mixture of relief and nervousness. Gerald's dislike was palpable. Miss Marple observed Hartley carefully during tea. His charm was polished, but his eyes were calculating. When he spoke to Celia, the girl shrank away. Break time 0.5s. Miss Marple later managed a private word with him in the hall. You knew Sir Reginald slightly, I believe? She asked. Only by reputation, Hartley replied. A difficult man, by all accounts. Vivienne, Mrs. Ashworth, often spoke of the strain he placed on the family, particularly on her finances. Hartley's smile faltered for a second. I'm a businessman, Miss Marple. I help where I can, even when help involves forged signatures and secret meetings in the garden. His expression hardened. You have a vivid imagination for an old lady. Imagination has very little to do with it, she said softly. Observation is a different matter. Hartley left soon after, promising to return for the funeral. His departure lifted some tension, but added new layers of suspicion. As evening approached, break time 05s. Miss Marple found Celia crying quietly in the library, a worn copy of Mother Goose open on her lap. He used to read this to me, the girl whispered. The crow rhyme especially. He said real life had more than 24 blackbirds, some baked in pies, some flying free, but the ones inside the house were the most dangerous. Miss Marple sat beside her and took the girl's hand. Your great-uncle carried a heavy burden from the war. He believed someone close to him had betrayed their country and their comrades. That guilt and the fear that followed slowly killed him long before the poison, but the final act was deliberate. Celia looked up, terrified. Do you know who did it? Not entirely, Miss Marple admitted. But I am getting closer. And I promise you this, my dear, the truth will come out. It always does. break time 05s, though it may hurt a great many people first. Outside, the wind rose again, rattling the windows like bony fingers seeking entry. Rosemere Hall held its breath, waiting for the next revelation. The hidden death was beginning to reveal its true, chilling face. The day of Sir Reginald Ashworth's funeral dawned cold and mercilessly clear. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the gardens of Rosemere Hall glistening with moisture. As though the earth itself had wept through the night, black-clad figures moved like shadows across the gravel drive, as villagers and distant relatives arrived in small, solemn groups. The church bells of St. Mary Mead tolled slowly in the distance, their sound carried on the sharp October wind. Miss Marple stood at the drawing-room window, in her best black coat and hat, watching the procession form. Funerals, break time equals .05s. She had always thought, had a way of stripping away pretense. People revealed themselves in how they mourned, or how they pretended to. Celia had refused to attend the service at the last moment, choosing instead to remain in the house with one of the maids. "I want to remember him alive," she had whispered to Miss Marple that morning, her young face tight with grief. Not in a box. Gerald and Vivian led the family group, walking arm in arm with practiced dignity. Maud Ellison followed behind, veil drawn down, her step measured and stiff. Desmond Hartley had appeared once more, offering his sleek black car and murmured sympathies. His presence irritated Gerald visibly, but Vivienne seemed to draw strength from it. The service itself was brief and dignified. The vicar spoke of duty, family, and the scars left by war. Break time 05s. Miss Marple sat near the back of the small church, her hands folded, listening not to the words but to the silences between them. When the hymn Abide With Me rose, she noticed Vivian's voice falter on the high notes. Gerald stared straight ahead, jaw clenched. Only Maud sang with something approaching genuine feeling, or perhaps it was triumph. After the burial in the family plot behind the church, the mourners returned to Rosemere Hall for the traditional cold collation. The drawing room and dining room had been opened up, and long tables bore ham, cold salmon, cheeses, and sombre fruitcakes. Voices were kept low at first, but as sherry and whiskey circulated, the volume rose and old tensions resurfaced. Miss Marple moved quietly among the guests, her sharp ears catching fragments of conversation. Break time more fives. "Always," said Reginald would go suddenly. "The will is most irregular, tying them to this old place. Heard there was digitalis involved. Police are treating it as suspicious now." She found Celia in the morning room, curled in a window seat with a book unopened on her lap. The girl looked up with relief when Miss Marple entered. "I couldn't face them all," Celia confessed, pretending to be sad when half of them are only here for the reading of the will or to gossip. Did it go well as such things can?" Miss Marple replied, sitting beside her. She took the girl's cold hand in hers. "Your great-uncle was respected, even if he was not always loved in later years. That counts for something." Celia's eyes filled with tears. "He trusted me with the nursery secret. Break time 05s. I feel like I failed him by not understanding sooner." Miss Marple reached into her handbag and produced the wartime photograph she had taken from the tin box. "Tell me, my dear, do you recognize any of these faces besides your great-uncle?" Celia studied the image carefully. Her finger hovered over the scratched face. "That's Captain Voss, I think. Great-uncle mentioned him in one of his rants. He said Voss had a sister, or a cousin, who married into an English family during the war." She frowned. "I can't remember the name." Miss Marple felt a small thrill of connection. A sister or cousin? How very interesting. Before she could pursue the thought, raised voices echoed from the hall. Gerald and Desmond Hartley had stepped outside for what was meant to be a private conversation. But their argument had spilled into earshot. Break time .5s. "You've bled my wife dry with your so-called loans," Gerald shouted. I know about the signatures. I know about the meetings in the garden. If you think you'll get your claws into Rosemere Hall through her, you're mistaken." Hartley's voice remained smooth, but carried a dangerous edge. "Your uncle was a paranoid old man who destroyed his own fortune with bad investments. Vivienne came to me for help, as a friend. If you can't provide for your family, perhaps someone else should." Miss Marple stepped quietly onto the terrace in time to see Gerald's face darken with fury. Vivienne rushed out to separate them, her perfume, the same heavy jasmine scent, drifting strongly on the breeze. "Enough," she hissed. "Both of you. This is Reginald's funeral day." "Have you no shame?" Miss Marple retreated before she was noticed. "Break time equals 05s. But the scene confirmed what she had long suspected. Vivienne's financial desperation had driven her into Hartley's web. Whether that desperation had led her further to the study window on the night of the death remained to be proven. Later that afternoon, when most guests had departed, Inspector Craddock asked Miss Marple for a private word in the study. The room had been cleaned, but still felt heavy with its recent tragedy. "You were right about the digitalis, Miss Marple," he admitted. "Administered over at least 3 or 4 days, with a stronger dose on the final evening. Someone had access to his whiskey decanter and knew his habits perfectly." Miss Marple nodded. "And the window, Inspector? It was open when the body was found." "According to the family, yes. Sir Reginald sometimes opened it for air, even on cool nights. Break time point 05s. The flower bed below shows no disturbance, but we did find faint marks on the windowsill that could be from a long pole or stick. Something used to pass an object through, perhaps. Or to retrieve one," Miss Marple murmured. She produced the fountain pen cap from her handbag, wrapped carefully in a handkerchief. "I found this in the garden. It matches the pen on his desk." Craddock's respect for her grew visibly. "You continue to surprise me, madam." As evening fell, Miss Marple sought out Maud Ellison, who had retired early to the small sitting room. The woman was drinking brandy and staring into the fire. "You knew Captain Voss's family, did you not?" Miss Marple asked without preamble. Maud started, nearly spilling her drink. "What makes you say that?" "The photograph. And certain letters. Break, time mork 05s. Your brother believed there had been a betrayal in France. Information passed to the Germans that cost lives. He suspected someone close, someone who had married into the family, perhaps." Maud's face went very still. "My late husband had a cousin who knew Voss, that is all. Ancient history. It has nothing to do with Reginald's death." "On the contrary," Miss Marple said softly, "I believe it has everything to do with it. Your brother was slowly poisoned, not just with digitalis, but with reminders of the past. Letters, hints, the nursery rhymes sung at night. Someone wanted him to suffer before he died. Someone who knew that destroying a man's peace of mind was the surest way to stop his heart." Maud set her glass down with a trembling hand. For the first time, real fear showed in her eyes. "You don't know what you're meddling with. Break time Hall-5s." Old woman. Some secrets should stay buried. Miss Marple rose to leave, but paused at the door. "Buried secrets have a way of poisoning the ground around them, Mrs. Ellison, and this house has been poisoned long enough." As she climbed the stairs toward her room, Miss Marple heard soft piano music coming from the music room. Celia was playing, a sad, haunting melody that spoke of loss and old nursery rhymes, turned into something darker. The crows were circling closer now, and one of them, Miss Marple was certain, was about to make a fatal mistake. The hours following the funeral dragged with a peculiar heaviness, as though Rosemere Hall itself were exhausted by grief and pretense. Most of the mourners had departed by late afternoon, leaving the family and a few lingering guests to face the long evening. The drawing-room fire burned low, break, time or 5 casting, flickering shadows across the walls and making the portraits of long-dead Ashworths seem to lean forward in silent judgment. Miss Marple had changed into a soft grey wool dress, and sat once more with her knitting, though her fingers moved with unusual slowness. Her mind was far from stitches and patterns. The pieces were aligning themselves now, not neatly, for human motives were never tidy, but with the quiet inevitability of a tide coming in. Celia had emerged from her solitude and was playing the piano again in the adjoining music room. The notes of an old ballad drifted through the half-open door, sweet and melancholy. Miss Marple recognised it as one Sir Reginald had been fond of in earlier years. The music seemed to pain Gerald, who poured himself another large whisky and stood staring into the fire. Break time equals 05s. Vivienne moved restlessly about the room, straightening cushions that needed no straightening. Her usual poise had cracked. Dark circles showed beneath her carefully applied powder. Desmond Hartley had stayed on, uninvited but apparently unwilling to leave. He sat near Vivienne, speaking to her in low tones that carried just far enough for Miss Marple to catch fragments. Reassurances about money, about new beginnings. Maud Ellison had withdrawn to a corner chair with a book she was not reading. Her face wore the closed, watchful expression of someone guarding dangerous knowledge. It was Celia who broke the fragile peace. The music stopped abruptly. The girl appeared in the doorway, her face flushed. "I found something," she said, her voice trembling but determined. In the nursery, under the floorboard again, someone had moved the box. Break time .05s. But they missed this. She held up a small folded piece of paper, yellowed with age but with fresher ink at the bottom. Miss Marple set her knitting aside as the others gathered closer, drawn despite themselves. Celia read aloud in a quiet, clear voice. "Reginald, if this reaches you, know that I did what I thought was right at the time. Voss convinced me the information would save more lives than it cost. I was a fool. The guilt has never left me. If you can find it in your heart..." A heavy silence descended. Maud rose slowly from her chair, her face ashen. "That is not, I never wrote that." But her denial lacked conviction. Gerald stared at his aunt with dawning horror. "Aunt Maud, you!" Miss Marple spoke gently. The initial M and the reference to Voss. "Mrs. Ellison, your late husband's cousin was connected to Captain Voss. Break time equal 5s. Was she not? But I think the connection was closer than that. You knew Voss personally during the war years." Maud's hand tightened on the back of her chair. For a long moment she said nothing. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and bitter. "Yes, I knew Leonard Voss. We were close. Reginald introduced us before everything went wrong. When the mission failed and men died, Leonard panicked. He told me he had passed information. Not for money, he swore, but because he believed it would shorten the war. I helped him cover his tracks. I burned letters. I lied to my own brother." Her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Reginald suspected for years but could never prove it. After my husband died, I came here hoping for forgiveness. Instead, he tormented me with hints and half-accusations. Break time 05s, the nursery rhyme. He would sing it when he knew I was listening. One for sorrow. He meant me. I was the first crow." Vivienne let out a shaky breath. "So you killed him? To stop the torment?" "I did not." Maud's voice rose sharply. "I hated what he had become, but I did not poison him. I wanted him to suffer, yes. I confess that. But murder? No." Desmond Hartley cleared his throat. "This is all very dramatic. But perhaps we should leave such matters to the police." Miss Marple turned her calm blue eyes on him. "And you, Mr. Hartley? Your role in this household has been rather supportive, especially toward Mrs. Ashworth. One might almost say indispensable." Hartley smiled thinly. "I resent your implications, madam." "Implications?" Miss Marple's voice remained mild. But there was steel beneath the velvet. Break time 05s. The expensive perfume on the study curtains matches the scent Vivienne wears when she meets you. The soil on her evening slippers on the night of the death. The urgent conversation beneath the study window. The financial documents with forged signatures. These are not implications, Mr. Hartley. They are observed facts. Vivienne sank into a chair, covering her face with her hands. It's true. I met Desmond that night. I begged him for more time on the loans. Reginald had found out about the debts. He threatened to change the will again and disinherit Gerald entirely. I was desperate. I went to the window and spoke to Desmond from outside, but I swear I did not harm him. When Reginald cried out later, I was already back in my room. Gerald looked at his wife, as though seeing her for the first time. Break time 05s. The pain in his eyes was raw and deeply human. All these years, Vivienne. I knew we had difficulties, but this... Tears slipped down Vivienne's cheeks. I did it for us, for Celia. I was terrified of losing everything. Miss Marple watched the emotional storm with deep sadness. These were not cartoon villains, but ordinary people who had made terrible choices. Choices born of fear, weakness, and love twisted by circumstance. The slow poisoning of Sir Reginald had begun long before the digitalis. It had started with guilt, silence, and the erosion of trust. Later that night, when the household had finally retired, Miss Marple remained downstairs. She moved quietly through the dimly lit corridors until she reached the study. The room felt colder than the rest of the house. She stood behind the great oak desk and closed her eyes. Break time .05s, trying to reconstruct the final evening. A tired, angry old man. A conversation through the window. A final dose slipped into the whiskey while his attention was diverted. The door locked from inside. The cry of pain. The end. She opened her eyes and noticed something she had missed before. A faint smear on the edge of the desk drawer. Lipstick? No. Something else. She took a clean handkerchief and gently rubbed the mark. It came away faintly pinkish. Foxglove petals. Crushed. Miss Marple's expression grew grave. The final piece was nearly in place. The hand that had delivered the poison had been trembling, enough to leave this trace. As she turned to leave, she heard a soft footstep in the corridor. Someone was watching. She spoke calmly into the darkness. You may as well come in, my dear. Break time equals 05s. It is very late for wandering. The figure hesitated, then stepped forward. It was Celia. The girl's face was streaked with tears. In her hand she held a small medicine bottle. I found this in Mother's room, she whispered. Hidden behind the books. It has digitalis written on the label. Oh, Miss Marple, what have we done to each other? Miss Marple took the bottle gently and put her arm around the trembling girl. The house seemed to hold its breath around them. The crows had come home to roost at last. The grandfather clock in the hall struck 2 with a hollow, mournful chime that seemed to echo through every corridor of Rosemere Hall. Miss Marple stood in the study with her arm around young Celia, the small medicine bottle heavy in her other hand. The girl was shaking. Break tie .05s. Not from cold, but from the terrible weight of what she had discovered. Come, my dear, Miss Marple said softly, guiding her to the worn leather sofa. Sit down before you fall. There, that's better. Now breathe slowly. We cannot think clearly when our hearts are racing. Celia clutched Miss Marple's hand like a lifeline. It was in Mother's dressing table, hidden behind her scent bottles. The label says digitalis tincture. Great-uncle was taking something similar for his heart. But this bottle, it's stronger. Why would she hide it? Miss Marple looked at the label carefully. The handwriting was neat, professional. A chemist's label from Milchester. The bottle was nearly empty. Before she could answer, footsteps sounded in the corridor. Gerald appeared in the doorway, still dressed in his funeral clothes. Break time equal 5s. His tie loosened, and his face etched with exhaustion. Behind him came Vivienne, wrapped in a silk dressing gown, her hair falling loosely about her shoulders. She stopped abruptly when she saw the bottle in Miss Marple's hand. "What is this?" Gerald demanded. His voice cracked. "Celia, what are you doing down here?" Celia burst into tears. "I couldn't sleep. I went to Mother's room to talk. I saw the bottle." "Father, tell me it's not true. Tell me she didn't." Vivienne's face drained of all colour. She swayed slightly and caught the back of a chair for support. "It's not what you think, I swear on my life." Miss Marple spoke with gentle authority. "Perhaps we should all sit down. Accusations in the middle of the night seldom lead to clarity, but truth, however painful, break time 05s, must come out now." They settled uneasily around the cold fireplace. Miss Marple placed the medicine bottle on the low table between them like a silent witness. The study felt smaller, more intimate, and far more dangerous than it had during daylight hours. Vivienne began speaking in a rush, her voice low and desperate. Reginald had been getting worse, more paranoid, more cruel. He was reducing Gerald's allowance bit by bit. He threatened to disinherit us completely if I didn't end my association with Desmond. I was terrified. I went to our doctor weeks ago, saying I needed something to help me sleep. He prescribed a mild sedative, but I asked the chemist for something stronger, for my nerves. I never meant to use it on Reginald. I only wanted options. Break time equals 05s. Something to make him calmer if he became violent with his accusations. Gerald stared at his wife in disbelief. "You brought poison into this house, knowing how fragile his heart was?" "I was desperate," Vivienne cried. "You don't know what it's like, living under his constant suspicion. The way he looked at us all, as though we were enemies. After that night in the garden with Desmond, when Reginald opened the window and shouted at me, I was frightened he would cut us off immediately. I went back inside through the side door. Later, I slipped a few drops into his decanter. Just a few. Enough to make him drowsy and stop his shouting. I swear I didn't think it would kill him." The confession hung in the air like smoke. Celia looked at her mother with heartbroken eyes. "You poisoned him? Because of money?" Miss Marple sighed deeply. Break time 05s. Her blue eyes filled with compassion rather than condemnation. "Fear makes people do terrible things, my dear. Mrs. Ashworth did not intend murder, I believe, but intention is not the same as result. The digitalis accumulated. Sir Reginald's heart, already weakened by years of worry and guilt, could not withstand the final dose. Gerald buried his face in his hands. The strong, somewhat weak man who had tried so hard to live up to his uncle's expectations was crumbling. All of this, the debts, the lies, the affair with Hartley, it was my failure. I should have been stronger. I should have protected you both from him and from myself. A new voice cut through the darkness from the doorway. "And what about me?" Maud Ellison stepped into the room, her grey hair unbound, making her look older and strangely vulnerable. Break time equals 05s. No one ever asks what I endured. Reginald knew about my connection to Voss. He enjoyed reminding me of it in small, vicious ways for years. The nursery rhyme, the letters he would leave where I could find them. He was killing me slowly too. Miss Marple turned to her. "You added to his torment, Mrs. Ellison. You sent anonymous notes, did you not? Reminders of 1943. You wanted him to suffer as you had suffered. Maud did not deny it. He deserved it. But I did not kill him. I only wanted him to feel what it was like to live with guilt every single day." The room fell into heavy silence, broken only by the faint ticking of the clock and Celia's quiet sobbing. Miss Marple looked at each of them in turn. The guilty, the weak, the young and innocent caught in the middle. Her heart ached for all of them. Break time 05s. This was the true tragedy of Rosemere Hall. Not one villain, but several broken people whose flaws had compounded into murder. "There is still one piece missing," Miss Marple said at last. "The fountain pen cap found in the garden. The conversation at the window. The final cry. Someone or something is still not accounted for." Vivienne lifted her head. "Desmond left after the argument. He couldn't have." But Miss Marple raised a hand. "Mr. Hartley may have played a larger role than we realise. Greed is a powerful poison too." She stood slowly, feeling the weight of her years and the heavier weight of knowledge. We should try to rest what remains of the night. Inspector Craddock will need clear heads in the morning. But before we part, let me say this. Sir Reginald died of a weak heart, break time 05s. But that heart had been broken long before the digitalis ever touched it. By war, by betrayal, by the slow realization that those he loved most had turned against him. Celia looked up, her young face streaked with tears. "Can anything be saved, Miss Marple? Or is the whole family poisoned?" Miss Marple touched the girl's cheek with grandmotherly tenderness. "There is always hope for the young, my dear. You have a good heart. Do not let this darkness claim it." As the others drifted away to their rooms like ghosts, Miss Marple remained in the study a few moments longer. She picked up the medicine bottle and slipped it into her pocket. Then she noticed something she had missed earlier. A single sheet of notepaper tucked beneath the blotter on the desk. Break time 05s. In Sir Reginald's shaky hand were written the final lines of the nursery rhyme. 5 for silver, 6 for gold, 7 for a secret never to be told. A secret, Miss Marple thought, that was finally coming into the light. But she sensed, with a chill that had nothing to do with the cold night air, that the true hand behind the final act had not yet been fully revealed. Someone in this house was still hiding the deepest treachery of all. Dawn crept over Rosemere Hall with reluctance, painting the grey stone walls in pale, watery light. The storm had passed, but a heavy mist clung to the gardens, turning the familiar landscape into something ghostly and uncertain. Miss Marple had slept very little. She stood at her bedroom window, watching the slow rise of the sun, a break time 05s. Mind turning over the confessions of the night like pieces in a particularly painful puzzle, a soft knock sounded at her door. It was Celia, still in her dressing gown, her eyes swollen from crying. "Miss Marple, the inspector has arrived. He says he wants to speak to everyone before anyone leaves the house. Father looks terrible, Mother won't stop shaking, and Aunt Maud, she's just sitting there staring at nothing." Miss Marple touched the girl's shoulder gently. "Courage, my dear. The truth, once fully faced, can be a harsh medicine, but it is still medicine. Go and dress. I shall be down directly." When she entered the drawing room 20 minutes later, the atmosphere was thick with dread. Inspector Craddock stood by the fireplace, his notebook open. Gerald sat rigidly in an armchair. Vivian huddled beside him. Break time equals 05s, her face pale and drawn. Maud occupied her usual corner, unnaturally still. Desmond Hartley had been summoned back from the village inn and now stood apart, his polished charm noticeably absent. Craddock cleared his throat. "I have the full laboratory report. The digitalis was indeed introduced into Sir Reginald's whisky decanter over several days, with a concentrated dose on the night of his death. The bottle found in Mrs. Ashworth's room matches the substance exactly." Vivienne made a small, broken sound. "But," Craddock continued, glancing at Miss Marple, "there are complications. The timing and the locked room suggest assistance or additional manipulation. Miss Marple, you indicated you had further observations." Miss Marple sat down carefully, arranging her skirt with hands that appeared frail, but were perfectly steady. "Thank you. Break time .05s, Inspector. This has not been a simple case of one wicked person committing murder. It has been a tragedy built layer by layer over many years." She looked at each of them with genuine sorrow. Sir Reginald was poisoned in body. Yes, but he had been poisoned in spirit long before. She turned first to Maud. "You, Mrs. Ellison, fed his paranoia for years. Anonymous reminders of the wartime betrayal. The nursery rhyme sung, or left where he would hear it. You wanted him to suffer as you had suffered, carrying the guilt of what happened in France." Maud's lips trembled, but she said nothing. Miss Marple continued gently. "Mr. Hartley, you exploited Vivian's fear. You encouraged her financial dependence, knowing it would drive her to desperate measures. You met her beneath the study window that night. Break time 05s. Perhaps you even suggested she use the digitalis. Not to kill, of course, but to manage Sir Reginald. Hartley's face tightened. You can prove nothing. I do not need to prove everything, Miss Marple said calmly. Only what matters. Mrs. Ashworth administered the poison out of fear for her family's future, but she did not act entirely alone in the final act. A silence fell. Celia's eyes widened in horror. Miss Marple reached into her handbag and produced the small medicine bottle along with the crumpled note Sir Reginald had hidden. There was one more person who entered the study that night after Vivienne returned to the house. Someone who knew the old nursery rhyme better than anyone. Someone Sir Reginald trusted enough to open the window for, even in his anger. All eyes turned towards Celia. The girl recoiled. No, break time 05s. I would never. Not intentionally, my dear, Miss Marple said, her voice filled with compassion. You went to speak with your great-uncle after your parents argued. You wanted to plead with him, to tell him you didn't want the London marriage your mother was pushing. You found him distressed after the conversation with Vivienne. In your distress, you gave him his usual heart tonic, except it was the wrong bottle, the one your mother had hidden. Celia's face crumpled. I only wanted to help him calm down. He was so upset. He asked me to pour his whiskey. I saw the medicine bottle on the side table and thought, oh God. She began to sob uncontrollably. Gerald moved to comfort his daughter, but his own face was wet with tears. Miss Marple's eyes were gentle but unwavering. It was an accident born of love and fear, my dear. Break time 05s, but the others created the conditions for that accident. The slow erosion Sir Reginald spoke of, the hidden death, was the work of many hands. Maud's bitterness, Vivienne's desperation, Hartley's greed, and Celia's innocent attempt to bring peace. Inspector Craddock looked stunned. Then it wasn't premeditated murder. Not in the classical sense, Miss Marple replied. It was a hidden death indeed. Death by 1,000 small cuts to the soul, ending in one final unintended dose. Sir Reginald himself understood this. That is why he wrote that last note about the secret never to be told. He knew the poison had come from those closest to him. Vivienne suddenly stood up. It was me. I put the digitalis in the decanter. I accept full responsibility. Celia mustn't suffer for my sins. Gerald pulled his wife back down. No. Break 5s. We all share this guilt. Every one of us failed him in different ways. The room dissolved into quiet weeping and broken apologies. Miss Marple watched with a heavy heart. This was the part outsiders rarely saw. The moment when the mask of respectability fell away and ordinary, flawed human beings confronted what they had become. Desmond Hartley tried to slip toward the door, but Inspector Craddock blocked his path. Not so fast, Mr. Hartley. We have questions about fraudulent loans and forged documents. As the inspector began making arrests and arrangements, Miss Marple drew Celia aside near the window. The mist was lifting outside, revealing the garden in soft morning light. You must not let this destroy you, child, she said quietly. Your great-uncle's greatest sorrow was losing faith in those he loved. Break time 05s. Your greatest duty now is to live with honesty and kindness. That will be your way of making amends. Celia nodded through her tears. The nursery rhyme. He tried to warn us all along, didn't he? 7 for a secret never to be told. Yes, Miss Marple murmured. And now the secret is told. The crows have finally settled. Outside, the first weak rays of sunlight touched the ivy-covered walls of Rosemere Hall. The house looked less forbidding in the light, though its shadows would linger for many years to come. Miss Marple felt suddenly very tired. The pattern was complete. The hidden death had been brought into the open, not through dramatic confrontation, but through the patient gathering of small truths. A missing pen cap, a trace of perfume, soil on a slipper, and the sorrowful echo of a child's nursery rhyme. Break time 05s. Yet as she looked at the broken family before her, she knew that solving the crime was only the beginning. Healing would take far longer. The mist had lifted completely by midday, revealing Rosemere Hall in its quiet, faded dignity. Police cars stood in the drive, their presence jarring against the old stone and ivy. Inspector Craddock had worked efficiently, taking statements and making the necessary arrangements. Desmond Hartley was already in custody, facing charges of fraud and conspiracy. Vivian Ashworth would face lesser charges, though her cooperation and genuine remorse would likely count in her favour. Maud Ellison remained at liberty for now, her own sins judged more by conscience than by law. Miss Marple sat once more, in the morning room, her knitting needles clicking softly. The familiar rhythm soothed her as it always did. Break, time, row fives. Celia sat at her feet on a low stool, pale but calmer now that the worst had been spoken. "Will we ever be able to live here again?" the girl asked quietly. "After everything that's happened?" Miss Marple looked out at the garden. "Houses are only stone and wood, my dear. They take their character from those who live in them. Rosemere Hall has known great sorrow, but it has also known happier times. It is for your family now to decide what future it will hold." Gerald entered the room, looking older than his 40 years. He had aged visibly in the past few days. He placed a hand on his daughter's shoulder. "The solicitor has been on the telephone. We can sell part of the estate if needed. We shall manage, somehow. But more importantly," his voice caught, "break time 05s. We must try to become the family your great-uncle once hoped we would be." Vivienne followed him in. Her elegant mask had fallen away entirely, leaving a tired, remorseful woman who looked surprisingly more human. She knelt beside Celia and took her hands. "I was so afraid of losing everything that I lost the most important things," she whispered. "Can you ever forgive me?" Celia hesitated, then embraced her mother. The gesture was awkward, full of lingering pain, but it was a beginning. Miss Marple watched them with gentle eyes. She had seen many families shattered by crime, and many more slowly mend themselves. Healing was never swift or complete, but it was possible when people chose honesty over comfort. Later that afternoon, as she prepared to leave, Dr. Haydock arrived to drive her back to St. Mary Mead. Before departing, a break time 05s. Miss Marple asked for one final moment alone in the study. The room was quiet now. The heavy curtains had been drawn back, letting in clean autumn light. She stood behind the great oak desk where Sir Reginald had died and spoke softly, almost to the air itself. "You were a hard man, Reginald Ashworth, but you were not an evil one. You carried the weight of old betrayals and let them poison your later years. Yet in the end you tried to warn them. The nursery rhyme was your last message. 7 for a secret never to be told, and now it has been told." She touched the desk lightly with her gloved fingers. "Rest in peace, my dear. The hidden death is hidden no longer." As she turned to leave, she noticed one last small detail, a single crow feather lying on the windowsill. She picked it up, smiled faintly, and slipped it into her handbag. Break time equals .05s. A reminder that some patterns in life repeat themselves, generation after generation, until someone has the courage to break them. The drive back to St. Mary Mead was peaceful. Dr. Haydock glanced at his old friend several times before speaking. "You look tired, Jane. Was it very bad? Worse than many? And yet not the worst I have seen," she replied thoughtfully. "There was no single monster in that house, Doctor. Only ordinary people who allowed fear, greed, and old guilt to twist them. The true poison was not the digitalis. It was the slow erosion of love and trust." Sir Reginald understood that in the end. When they reached her little cottage, the garden looked wonderfully ordinary and reassuring. The chrysanthemums were still blooming bravely, and her neighbour's cat sat washing itself on the wall of break time 05s. Miss Marple thanked the doctor and went inside. She removed her hat and coat, made herself a cup of strong tea, and settled into her favourite armchair by the fire. Her knitting lay ready on the side table. She thought of young Celia. and hoped the girl would find the strength to build a better life. She thought of Gerald and Vivienne, who would have to live with what they had done, and of Maud, whose bitterness had eaten away at her own happiness for so long. Human nature is very much the same everywhere, she murmured to herself. We none of us are as good as we hope, nor quite as bad as we fear. But we can always choose to do better tomorrow. Outside, the church bells began to ring for evensong. Their clear, steady notes floated across the village green. A sound of continuity and quiet hope. Miss Marple picked up her knitting. The soft lambswool shawl for the vicar's grandchild was nearly finished. Life in St. Mary Mead would go on, with its small dramas and gentle rhythms. Another mystery had been solved, another hidden truth brought into the light. Yet as the needles clicked steadily in the firelight, she allowed herself one final quiet reflection. The crows had flown, but their shadows would linger at Rosemere Hall for many years to come. And somewhere, in the hearts of those who remained, the old nursery rhyme would echo as both warning and lament, one for sorrow. Miss Marple sighed, adjusted her spectacles and continued knitting. The pattern, at least, was complete,